It's safe to say that over the last few years, since I've started collecting retro games a little bit more seriously, I've built up something of a healthy collection. There's a number of games in there that I've picked up with the full intention of playing there and then, but for one reason or another, just kept putting it off. Now, that's not an unfamiliar story for so many of us into gaming. Between in-store sales, Steam sales, Humble Bundles, and so much more, it's so easy for us to pick up titles with the full intention of getting around to them at some point, but just throwing them onto a pile. Now, on the one hand, it's great to have such a vast selection of games, something we can go to when we're, to suit any mood we're in. But on the other hand, it's very easy to feel a little bit of guilt at this huge pile of games that just seems impossible to get through. So, over the last couple of months, I've been making a big effort to organise all my retro consoles and my entire collection. And what I've done for this particular video is I've picked out 10 games from my retro collection that I'm aiming to play through this year that I would like to share with you all right now. The first game on our list is Syphon Filter. This is a game I had as a kid, but I never actually finished it. Syphon Filter tells the story of Gabe Logan and his race to stop terrorists unleashing the terrifying Syphon Filter virus, a virus that can target particular demographics of anyone in the world's population. The game was developed by Eidetic, who would later become Bend Studio, the people behind Days Gone. It was released to critical and commercial acclaim back in 1999. Series would go on to have 5 more titles, the last of which being Logan's Shadow, which was released in 2007 on the PSP, and then 2010 for the PS2 for in North America only. Syphon Filter was praised at the time for its gameplay, which mixed traditional third-person action with stealth elements, as well as a highly cinematic storyline. It's generally classed as one of the PS1's must-play games, and this is one that I've been wanting to get around to again for quite some time. Next up on our list is Driver. Now, I had a demo of this when I was very, very young, and the demo featured the now notorious garage tutorial level, which challenged players to perform a variety of manoeuvres under an incredibly strict time limit. I was never able to complete this back in the day, and I've always wondered what lay beyond. Now, Driver sees you take on the role of John Tanner, a detective and former racer who's sent undercover to investigate and bring down a crime syndicate. It was known for its fast-paced driving action, but also for allowing players to explore what was at the time impressive recreations of some of the world's most famous cities. The series had some ups and downs since the release of the first game, the last main title in the series being 2011's Driver San Francisco, which I absolutely adored. So the original Driver has been on my list for quite a long time, and it's one I'm definitely looking forward to tackling very soon. Although they weren't the first games to incorporate stealth into their gameplay, it could be argued that 1998 saw the birth of the stealth genre, with 3 titles being released that all made stealth part of their core gameplay: Metal Gear Solid, Thief, and Tenchu Stealth Assassins. Developed by Acquire and published by Activision, Tenchu saw you taking control of one of 2 assassins, Rikimaru or Ayame. You were given a target and set loose in a fairly open level to take down your target. The aim, of course, is to get in and out without being seen. Players would have to make use of their surroundings, various items such as poisoned rice cakes, shurikens or smoke bombs, to name but a few, as well as a trusty grappling hook. Players were ranked at the end of each level, depending on how well they did. The main characters have access to an expansive moveset with fully fledged melee combat system, as well as a variety of options for traversing the levels. Now, Tenchu as a series hasn't really been seen since Tenchu Shadow Assassins for the Wii and PSP, back in 2008 and 2009. From Software actually own the rights to the franchise, with Sekiro starting its life as a Tenchu title, going so far as to make the grappling hook one of its main game mechanics. This is a title I've always heard of and always been intrigued by. I'm admittedly not great at games that are more pure stealth, but nonetheless I'm very happy to give this one a go because I know how highly it's regarded. Of all the games in this list, Panzer Dragoon Saga is the only one that I don't actually own a physical copy of, so we are going to go with pure emulation for this one. Panzer Dragoon Saga was a 1998 JRPG released on the Sega Saturn. It was actually the third in the Panzer Dragoon series and was a deviation from the previous two titles, which were rail shooters, instead shifting to a fully fledged JRPG. The game released to critical acclaim, but received a limited release in the West. It's also never received a re-release on any other platform, making it incredibly desirable and leading to it becoming something of a cult classic. Copies of it will go for hundreds of pounds on eBay, pricing many collectors, including myself, out of getting a legitimate copy of it. The story follows the character of Edge, a mercenary who has been hired to guard an excavation site. One day, he fends off an ancient monster, uncovers a young girl buried in a wall, and sees the site attacked by a group called the Black Fleet. Edge survives the attack with the help of a flying dragon, and swears revenge on the fleet. The game allows you to explore on foot as Edge, traverse larger areas on your dragon, and of course, full-fledged battle system for fighting enemies. The game pushed the Saturn to its limits, features full voice acting and numerous FMV sequences. It's known to be just a little bit simpler than its contemporaries, and even significantly shorter, clocking in at just under 20 hours. Now, the Panzer Dragoon series has seen the first two games get a very recent HD re-release. As far as Saga goes, it's said that the original source code has been lost, so the chances of an official re-release are very unlikely, unless Sega do come out with a Sega Saturn Mini. Panzer Dragoon Saga has been a game that I've wanted to play for a hell of a long time, if just for the legend around it, but knowing that it's a genuinely great game only heightens that desire. Jumping forward a generation, to the PlayStation 2, we have The Getaway. Developed by Team Soho and released in 2002, The Getaway was a gritty, open-world crime action game set in and around London. Inspired by British gangster films such as Get Carter and Snatch, the game was initially supposed to come out alongside the PlayStation 2 itself, but due to development difficulties, it didn't land until late 2002, by which time it was competing with the likes of GTA 3 and 2002's GTA Vice City, which unfortunately led to people labelling it something of a GTA clone. But I do also remember it being lauded for its faithful recreation of London and its usage of licensed vehicles to aid in creating a much more realistic setting. The plot itself follows two characters, a former convict, Mark Hammond, who was forced back into a life of crime in order to protect his son from the head of a local crime organisation. Your other main character is Detective Frank Carter, who is investigating the said mob. One of the notable things about the game is that it attempted to be much more immersive and cinematic than other titles on the market at that time. The HUD was minimal, with directions given out via the car indicators, and player health was indicated by blood effects and changes to player movement. The Getaway would get a sequel in 2004 called Black Monday, which, if I enjoy this one, and I'm fully expecting to, I'll definitely be playing. I'm excited to play this one. You rarely see towns from the UK represented in such a way in games, especially back then, so I'm quite intrigued to see what was done with its recreation of London and how it holds up to this day. Sticking with the PS2, we move forward to 2004 with Midway's The Suffering, an action horror title which tells the story of Torque, a prisoner on death row who is in for a crime he has no memory of committing, namely the murder of his ex-wife and children. An earthquake hits the island prison he's in, and all sorts of supernatural stuff starts going down. Naturally, Torque must fight his way through it all, whilst also uncovering the truth behind what happened to him and his family. The Suffering was designed to be more of an action horror title than other horror titles at the time like your Resident Evils or Silent Hills. It attracted some criticism as some critics felt like the emphasis on action diluted the horror aspect. The game did, however, earn some praise for its inclusion of the morality system. The player was able to make choices throughout the story which would aid in determining the outcome, with 3 possible endings. The Suffering got a sequel in 2005 called Ties That Bind, which was well received, although not as much as the original title, and you can still get these games digitally on GOG, so if anyone's intrigued, it's quite an easy one to get hold of. I always like to pick a handful of games to play when it comes to Halloween. The Suffering was going to be one of my picks last year, but I just didn't get round to it. I remember hearing really good things about this when it came out, and I'm very keen to see how they blended the horror and action elements. I'm expecting to have a really fun time with this one. Sticking with the land of the supernatural, we come to Onimusha, or Onimusha Warlords to give it its full title. It's a hack-and-slash video game developed by Capcom and released in 2001 for the PS2, and it was later ported to the Xbox under the name Genma Onimusha. It focuses on the story of a samurai, Samanosuke Akechi, who is charged with rescuing Princess Yuji from the demons of Nobunaga Oda's army. The initial idea of this game was to create a ninja version of Resident Evil, and whilst many elements from Resident Evil do remain in the final product, such as the pre-rendered backgrounds, some of the camera angles, it is much more of an action game than a survival horror title. Onimusha Warlords was incredibly popular on its release, becoming the first PS2 game to reach 1 million sales. It spawned 3 more titles, and Warlords got a HD re-release back in 2018 for a number of platforms, and as of 2022, it said that there's an anime series in production. Now, technically, I've played this one before, but it was a very long time ago, and it was mostly watching a friend play through it. So it's one I've always wanted to revisit it, as it left a very strong impression, and I'd like to experience the gameplay for myself. Earlier this year, I finally played through Ocarina of Time on the N64, and I absolutely loved it. I can honestly see why it's lauded as one of the greatest games ever made. So naturally, I feel like I have to play the sequel. And it feels like a game I don't need to recap, but for those unaware, Majora's Mask is the direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, set mere months after the events of that game. Link ends up in Termina, where he learns that in just 3 days, a very terrifying looking moon will fall and destroy everything. Now along the way, Link makes use of the Ocarina from Ocarina of Time. He learns some new songs to control time, including resetting back to the start of this 3-day cycle. He also comes across various masks which can transform him into other beings. Majora's Mask was critically lauded. Much like Ocarina of Time, it's been hailed as one of the best N64 games, and probably one of the best games ever made. It's tonally very different to Ocarina of Time though, seen as being significantly darker and maybe a little bit quirkier, which perhaps did lead to it not selling quite as well as Ocarina of Time. It was also seen as being just a little bit more difficult due to the introduction of this 3-day cycle, which had this 3-day deadline on it. Now, similar to Ocarina of Time, I had actually tried the 3DS port of Majora's Mask. Something didn't necessarily click for me with that, but I'm hoping that playing it on the original hardware will give me a much better experience, much like Ocarina of Time did. Initially released all the way back in 1992 for the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, and developed by Electronic Arts, Desert Strike sees you taking control of an AH-64 Apache helicopter. You're let loose in a fairly open map and charged with completing a number of objectives in pretty much any order. Players not only had to worry about the health of their helicopter, but also fuel levels and ammunition of the variety of weapons you had. You could also complete optional objectives like picking up scattered prisoners of war across the map and bringing them back to your home base for rescue. Desert Strike would go on to spawn 4 sequels: Jungle, Urban, Soviet, and Nuclear, as well as a spiritual successor with Future Cop LAPD, which is another title that I do plan to play at some point. I had Desert Strike on the Amiga back in the early 90s, and I never really got very far in it, as it was quite a difficult game. It wasn't for the want of trying, and the game and series has always stuck with me. I also had Soviet Strike on the PS1 and absolutely loved it. So this entire franchise is one that I've really wanted to revisit. I always remember the somewhat non-linear nature of the game seeming so fresh back when I was younger, but also some of the more realistic elements like looking after the fuel of your helicopter and the ammunition levels, making it feel very different, albeit incredibly difficult. So I'm expecting this to be a challenging one to play through, but I'm also expecting to have a very good time with it. The final game on our list falls into the category of yet another game that I've played but never completed, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. So, Tomb Raider 2 is of course the sequel to the original Tomb Raider. It sees Lara taking off in search of the legendary Dagger of Zion. Her journey will take her initially to the Great Wall of China, then to Venice, to an oil rig, an underwater shipwreck, and the Tibetan foothills. Gameplay-wise, it's very similar to the original, with some additional bells and whistles, including the inclusion of vehicles. Lara's movement is still incredibly tanky, with players having to be careful about how they line up the jumps, getting the timing right, and of course, remembering to hit the grab button when performing your jumps. Now, I have so much love and nostalgia for that old style of gameplay when it comes to Tomb Raider. Every bit of traversal felt like its own little puzzle to solve, with you being punished for your mistakes, but it also feeling oh so rewarding when you were able to pull it all together. The game was released to critical acclaim, sold incredibly well. The series is of course legendary. Lara Croft was such a huge pop culture icon in the late 90s and early 2000s, crossing over into so much other media, spawning a film franchise, getting her own Lucasade advert. You couldn't move for Lara back in that time period. There's been some ups and downs for the series since. The early to mid-2000s saw mixed fortunes for the games, with Angel of Darkness being seen as a low point, but we did see the franchise get rebooted back in 2013 with a brand new trilogy. I'm incredibly excited to play through this one again. It's one I very nearly completed when I was younger, getting all the way to the final level, and then suffering losing all my memory card data. So I'm hoping this time around that won't happen. So there you have it, 10 retro games that I'm hoping to play through this year. Let me know your thoughts on my selection in the comments below. Do you have any experience with these games? Are you planning on clearing some of your own retro backlog this year? If so, what have you picked to get through? Until then, thank you very much for taking the time to watch this, and I hope to see you all again very soon. Goodbye.